Momentum looks strong, but distance doesn't hold. Volatility appears active, yet session boundaries are compressing inside the same range. The chart looks like expansion, but structure has not moved. The March 16th U.S. session formed between two higher timeframe references. Above, the upper boundary of the March 13th U.S. session. Below, the lower boundary of the February 4th U.S. session. This placement defines the environment. Because the session did not establish new structural territory, it opened inside inherited boundaries. This immediately limits distance. Not visibly, structurally. At first, price moved lower. That movement approached the upper boundary of the March 15th Asia session. This interaction matters, because the move was not targeting open space. It was targeting another session memory. When price moves between two boundaries, distance becomes conditional, not automatic. The move looked continuous. Candles extended. Momentum appeared consistent, but continuation failed. Instead of extending beyond the Asia boundary, price returned back into the March 16th U.S. session box. This is where contradiction forms. Movement expanded, but structure rejected the expansion. This creates friction. Continuation attempts now require more persistence, because the structure has already rejected one extension. Now time becomes dominant. Sessions are no longer creating separation. They are overlapping, and overlap changes behavior. When sessions overlap, boundaries become active zones, not passive levels. Each return increases interaction frequency. Each interaction increases structural weight. Now volatility must be reinterpreted. The 20 Bollinger Bands are flattening. Upper and lower bands narrowing. This is compression, but not quiet compression. Active compression. At the same time, the 4 Bollinger Bands expand after contraction, but the expansion width remains limited. This creates visible movement, but limited distance. This mismatch creates behavioral friction. Continuation attempts begin to stall earlier. Pullbacks begin to extend slightly deeper. Moves travel, but they do not hold. This is where position becomes constrained. Price is not relocating. It is negotiating. Between session boundaries. Between inherited structure. Between prior anchors. This reduces tolerance. It reduces margin for error, and it increases execution difficulty. If compression continues inside these overlapping sessions, distance remains limited. If persistence begins to hold beyond these boundaries, distance begins to expand. But until persistence appears, structure continues to recycle movement. Execution conditions remain in transition. The next structural shift appears through the Asia session interaction. The March 16th Asia session formed near the upper boundary of the U.S. session structure. This is not a neutral position. It is an edge position. And edges behave differently, because edges define decision zones. From that location, price attempted to extend upward. That extension targeted the February 4th U.S. session boundary. This is a higher time frame reference, which means it carries structural weight. The move looked clean. Candles extended with speed. Momentum appeared aligned, but continuation did not persist. Instead, price reversed and returned back down. This return is critical because it confirms lack of acceptance. When a move reaches a higher time frame boundary but fails to hold above it, the boundary strengthens, not weakens. Now, price returns to prior structure. The move reaches the lower boundary of the March 16th U.S. session and simultaneously interacts with the upper boundary of the March 15th Asia session. Now 3 boundaries are interacting. Upper U.S. session, lower U.S. session, prior Asia session. This increases interaction, and interaction changes execution conditions. Moves become shorter. Reactions become faster. Continuation becomes more difficult. This is not directional weakness. This is structural compression. Now distance must be evaluated differently. Distance is no longer measured by candle size. It is measured by persistence. and persistence is failing, repeatedly. This creates a cycle. Attempt, failure, return. Each cycle increases structural density, and density reduces tolerance. Now pressure shifts. Trendline slope begins to flatten. Directional pressure weakens. Instead, rotational pressure increases. Price begins oscillating between boundaries, not pushing through them. This is where behavioral friction intensifies. Continuation attempts stall earlier. Pullbacks deepen before stabilizing. Reaction speed increases, and holding becomes more difficult. Now position becomes even more constrained. Because price is not operating in open structure, it is operating inside layered boundaries. Between US session memory, between Asia session memory, between higher timeframe references. This is a compressed execution environment. If continuation begins to persist above the upper Asia boundary, distance expectations expand. If rejection continues at that boundary, compression tightens further, and movement becomes increasingly reactive. Execution conditions remain in transition. The next stage of structure appears in the March 17th session sequence. The US session forms again inside prior structure. Between the midpoint of the March 16th US session and the upper boundary of the March 15th Asia session. This confirms continuation of compression, because no session is establishing new structural space. All sessions are forming inside existing boundaries. Now price attempts to move upward. It briefly moves above the March 16th US session box and tests the upper boundary of the March 16th Asia session. This is a displacement attempt, but displacement is not persistence, because persistence requires duration, and duration has not formed. Now the Asia session forms, and it overlaps almost completely with the prior US session structure. This overlap is critical, because overlap increases density, and density increases friction. Now behavior changes again. Price moves below the session boundary, but it does not continue. Instead, it returns back into the same structural zone. This repetition defines the environment, not expansion, not relocation. Repetition. Now volatility confirms this structure. The 20 Bollinger Bands continue flattening, upper and lower bands narrowing further. This indicates compression. At the same time, the 4 Bollinger Bands continue expanding and contracting, but the width remains tight. This creates unstable movement, short bursts of expansion, immediate stalls, limited follow-through. Now all 5 axes align. Time sessions are overlapping. Volatility, compression dominates. Position, price remains inside boundaries. Interaction, boundary frequency increases. Pressure, slope weakens and rotates. This alignment defines the environment, not directional. Structural. Now execution behavior changes. Pullbacks extend deeper before stabilizing. Continuation attempts fail faster. Tolerance becomes narrow. Reaction speed increases. Distance becomes conditional. If displacement begins to persist above overlapping session boundaries, distance expands. If continuation continues to fail, compression tightens further, and movement continues cycling inside structure. Between sessions, between boundaries, between repeated interaction, execution conditions remain in transition.